Hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's discussion. My name is Antara Ghoshal Singh. I'm a fellow at the Strategic Studies program at the Observer Research Foundation. Today, we are going to talk about the rising tension in the Taiwan Strait and what it means for India. We'll try to understand India's options if tension intensifies further in the region and if there is actually a situation where invasion of Taiwan becomes a reality. To discuss this important issue with us, we have a great panel of speakers. We have Rear Admiral Sudarshan Srikhande, former head Naval Intelligence and Chief of Staff, SNC Indian Navy, Ms. Suhasini Haidar, diplomatic editor, The Hindu, Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan, Professor International Politics at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and Dr. Shana Hashmi, visiting fellow, Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation, affiliated scholar, the Research Institute for Indo-Pacific Affairs. Let me start with a brief background to the current developments in the Taiwan Strait. As many of us are aware, for the first time in decades, the possibility of a conflict in the Taiwan Strait looks very, very real today. The intensified Chinese military activities in the region, particularly in the last few years, have been a cause of concern for various regional powers as well as the United States. However, the recent Russian actions against Ukraine has further raised alarm in the US and elsewhere over the possibility of similar Chinese actions against Taiwan in near future. China, however, has refuted such claims and objected to any interference in its internal affairs. But for many, Ukraine and Taiwan has emerged as test cases for the willingness and resolve of the United States as well as the international community at large to uphold global norms against the use of military force to seize territory. With that, there has been an increased spotlight on the Taiwan issue in the United States foreign policy, and there are indications that the Biden administration might be moving away from its strategic ambiguity over Taiwan to strategic clarity. For instance, the US president on his first official visit to East Asia had indicated that if China takes military action against Taiwan, then the US might be intervening militarily. Most recently, the possibility of US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's imminent arrival in Taiwan has further raised the temperature in the Taiwan Strait. The Chinese side, as we know, have already issued strong warnings against the United States, urging it not to play with fire. Certain Chinese state media personality has even threatened of shooting down Pelosi's plane. And in this backdrop, it is being discussed all over the world, including in India, if we are really heading towards a fourth Taiwan crisis. If yes, can the world, already battered by the pandemic and the ill effects of the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, afford yet another major crisis like the Taiwan crisis? Will India, whose ties with Taiwan has been growing slowly but steadily, find its interest hampered in the region? Will Chinese military be further emboldened to threaten peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region? These are some of the questions that are doing rounds among strategic community world over, and we hope to address some of them in today's discussion. So without further delay, allow me to hand over the stage to our panelists. Let me invite Admiral Srikhande to make his opening remarks.
Thank you, Antara, and very nice to be here with my fellow panelists. It is indeed a difficult thing for everybody. One that could have worked out differently, but I think specifically on this, India need not take a position. It's one of those matters where it might be better, strategically speaking, diplomatically speaking, if India says that people have a right to visit, and it is for each individual state to take take that decision for themselves about how it plays out. Considering we do not have official diplomatic relations with Taiwan, and that we have always voiced, support for sovereignty, some some reaction of that type in the media, I think, might be adequate. I'm not too sure what the official position might be of the government. I have not seen any press release. I'm traveling myself, and but so therefore I've not been able to ascertain for myself on that. But the fellow panelists might be able to throw light on that. Certainly an unprecedented situation. I cannot recall of any possible visit, including a royal visit, during the imperial age, etc., which might have created friction like this. I do remember that there was a bit of a problem about receiving King William II in the UK, just before, when the war clouds were coming in, and yet he was received, and I think the situation was handled with a certain amount of finesse and pretended indifference to what was happening. So with Beijing having taken a strong stand on this and made certain statements, it is anybody's guess how this plays out. But I would doubt whether a conflagration might start over this. But we'll have to wait and see. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Srikande, for your interesting address. Now let me request Ms. Suhashini Haider to make her comments.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me to this discussion. I think it's important that in India, at least in public areas, forums of discussion, there must be a proper engagement with the issues that are at hand. After all, what we are seeing is a growing amount of conflict in the world. And the worst thing about any conflict is that it should take us by surprise. In any democracy, there should be that kind of discussion about how you would engage with these issues. Certainly, I think we have seen that there is a considerable amount of public anger at China ever since the transgressions at the line of actual controls in 2020. We've also seen a lot of public speaking about the possibility of supporting Taiwan. However, India's position remains very clear. India has said that it recognizes, one China. It recognizes the government in Beijing as the sole representative of China as well. And therefore, these kind of ambiguities, as Admiral Srikande said, it would be important for the government to set out how it views the visit by the American House Speaker, or whether it doesn't have a view at all. But I also think that the next stage in discussion is important to have, without being sensationalist about it, without being over dramatic. I think we must gauge what we are going to see, because particularly after Russia's actions in Ukraine, and I might add China's actions at the LAC, as well as other aggressions in the South China Sea, in the East Asia Sea as well, it is important for us to see what could possibly happen. And I think one of the questions that are constantly asked, and the Chinese strategic community is certainly discussing it, when they talk about the ideas of which fronts they are going to, take on. And I think that discussion must be held on how far India is willing to go. After all, if there is a war in the Taiwan Straits, would India do nothing at all, as we have done pretty much with the Russian invasion into Ukraine? In fact, let's remember that India recognized Ukraine as a sovereign entity, and even so, the government has not said any word to criticize Russia's actions over there. In this case, we don't recognize Taiwan as a sovereign entity, so would we actually go to the extent of making any kind of a statement at all? And then we could discuss other kind of actions that India may or may not want to take. But I do think that in our present scenario, it is necessary for these discussions to be held, and the government needs to engage with what is its policy. What is its policy towards Taiwan, for example? We hear a lot about India's supporting, more trade with Taiwan. So what does that mean? Does that in any way step out of India's diplomatic periphery or boundaries on how to deal with Taiwan? When it comes to the World Health Assembly, for example, Taiwan has at various times held an observer status at the World Health Assembly because it's considered an important country on dealing with the COVID crisis and all of that. Would India consider supporting that observer status again? So far, we have not shown that is something we are considering. So I do think it is very important to have these discussions on how far India would go and what a scenario that is emerging in the Taiwan Straits would mean for us here in Delhi.
Thank you, Suhasini, for your take. We will get back to you again in the course of the discussion. But before that, let me request Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan to make his address.
Thank you, and I hope you can hear me. Thank you for inviting me, and I almost entirely endorse what Suhasini just said, both in terms of the substantive issue, but also in terms of substantive issue in terms of not just the colossus visit, but also the larger looming threat of a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan and its consequence, as also entirely endorse what she said about the need for public discussions. I don't think we should shy away from public discussions on this issue because this is probably the most, if an invasion does happen, it's going to be the most cataclysmic event, not just for the global system, but also particularly for the Indo-Pacific and for India, because the consequences of a Chinese invasion is just incredibly horrendous to even imagine. The consequences, not only in terms of the death and destruction that would follow in Taiwan itself, but also for the larger international politics of the region. You could, I'm not sure. I don't think I can say very much about which way that invasion would go. It's one of the most difficult military operations, and I'm sure the Admiral will knows much more about this than I do. But the most difficult military operation is an amphibious landing, and Taiwanese territory is not particularly suited for amphibious landings. But on the other hand, China has been preparing for this for decades now, and so they might have solved some of these problems. I mean, I don't think they are at a stage where they have the full capacity to do it, but nevertheless, I mean, that could be very, very short. And the other part of the problem, I think, is that we tend to look at this in terms of what rational, what we might do. I mean, would we, if we were in China's shoes, in Xi Jinping's shoes, would we do something like this, which is all its attendant risks? But what we have seen with the Russian invasion of Ukraine is that the calculus is very different for some of these leaders, and so we cannot rule that out. And so if that does happen, if it is successful, we are looking at potentially a Chinese hegemony over Asia, much to India's detriment, but also possibly a large-scale war in the Indo-Pacific, which again is detrimental to Indian interest and security. So I think it is necessary that we try and sort out what India's interests are. And it is true that our position is one China policy, but even though we haven't, I don't think we have retreated that in the recent past, but nevertheless, that is our broad policy. But despite that policy, even given that policy, that's also the policy, of course, of the United States, in some sense, and not so much the rest of the world. But I think others have been more open about it in terms of what they think about a possible Chinese invasion. And I think, I don't think our views will necessarily entirely decide China's choices, but I think it can complicate China's calculus. And I think, therefore, even if we don't say anything beforehand, I think we can send sufficient signals about how we would view this. And of course, that first thing we need to decide is how we will view this, and then we can send up signals. And I think we should be very clear that that would be a disaster, and that that it would be something that we would strongly discourage China from attempting. But whatever issues that is there between Taiwan and China, that needs to be solved politically and peacefully. But I mean, I think those are signals that we should send, given the conditions, especially after this fall. After the Party Congress and so on, I don't know what the situation would be, in terms of China's characteristics. So, given the military preparation, I think it is something that we have to take seriously. Let me stop here, and I'll have to join later.
Thank you, Professor, for your remarks. Let me now request Dr. Sana Hashmi to make her opening remarks.
Thank you, Antara. But before I talk about what India should do and what are its options, I think what is also important to talk about the likelihood of China's invasion of Taiwan. And being in Taiwan, I think I can really add value to this discussion. And also, I think I have this responsibility of clearing a lot of misinformation that's going on about China's invasion of Taiwan and what is actually happening in Taiwan. So I believe that despite all the rhetoric that is coming out of China, and particularly regarding Pelosi's potential visit, it's unlikely that we're going to witness the fourth Taiwan Strait crisis anytime soon. And it's not at least going to happen because of Pelosi's Taiwan visit. And I feel there are several reasons, but one immediate reason is, of course, the 20th Party Congress is around the corner, that also Professor Rajagopalan also talked about. And she is also likely to secure the third term after the 20th Party Congress. So in the midst of such important developments in his political career, he doesn't want to deal with the issue of Taiwan, no matter how important Taiwan is for China. He has to justify to the domestic audience that he's worthy of becoming the president for life. But Taiwan is one issue that could make him appear weak, and there are solid chances that in a Taiwan contingency at this moment, China will be met with resistance from the US and even Japan. And I think this is Japan is one country that a lot of people aren't really talking about. Japan white paper, its diplomatic blue book, all has mention of Taiwan, that how Japan's security is directly linked to that of Taiwan, and how Taiwan is an indispensable partner to Japan. So it is highly unlikely that she is going to emerge victorious out of any Taiwan contingency in the near future. So I don't think it's the situation is really going to get out of control. But if at all China decides to invade Taiwan, if the situation escalates and China unilaterally takes action to breach the status quo, it will have repercussions for India as well. And I feel this is something that India has to realize and act accordingly. And this is a scenario that India and other countries that have similar concerns need to collectively avoid. But I believe that in India, we get to hear this a lot, that this is not a battle to fight. But slowly, India is waking up to the reality that Taiwan's security is also important to India's own security, and also the peace and stability of the Indo-Pacific region. But of course, India has limitations here. We all talk about India's adherence to the One China policy. And we have to be very clear that India is not really going to take any military is not really going to opt for any military option. India is not in a position to take a proactive stand in case of any contingency, primarily due to its own problem with China. And of course, its approach is restricted by One China policy. India has been cautious in expanding political ties with Taiwan. Even though we saw there were several positive developments and the momentum being built in the past few years, but I believe that nothing much has changed on the ground. India is still very, very cautious while engaging with Taiwan. And even if you look at the reaction that is coming out from China, that's primarily to dissuade countries. So this is not something that's new. There is no departure from the past when we come to China's approach specifically with respect to Pelosi's potential visit right now. All these statements, and people are really blowing the statement out of proportion, that what she talked about, how US is playing with fire. This is something that was also happened during Xi Biden November call. So I think these are the developments that have happened even in the past. So there's nothing new. And even if you look at it, I don't really see any major reaction from the Chinese government per se. This is all on the internet, and I think this is how the stakes have been built. So in my opinion, that I agree with Suhasini and also Professor Rajesh Gopalan, that I think it's really important for India to take a stand and for the sake of Indo-Pacific and for the sake of quadrilateral dialogue, that India has to take a stand if China at all decides to invade Taiwan.
Thank you, Dr. Hashmi, for your remarks. We have around half an hour with us to further discuss the issue. And I do have a list of questions for each of the panelists, but please feel free to intervene, to make comments, ask questions wherever you think fit. So my first question is to Admiral Srikande. Admiral, regarding the Pelosi episode, how do you think it is going to pan out? Which side do you think is going to blink first? And what would be the ramification for such a decision for either side?
As you know, Sana briefed us. It seems a visit, is quite likely to take place. If that happens, it would mean that Washington has not blinked on this, despite the conflicting signals that came out of the White House and the Pentagon about the advisability of this visit. It would mean that Washington has not blinked. So thereafter, it is up to Beijing now to ramp up or accept that, make all the noises it can, take some demonstrative action, but. In Clausewitzian term, if we ask the question, what is the value of the political object to go to war? In the sense, I agree with what Ms. Haider and Professor Rajgopalan were saying, that invading Taiwan would be one of the most serious events that would have happened in recent times. In some ways, more serious than the invasion of Ukraine. On India's part, I think the public discourse is significant. It is not too small, but then in the public discourse, Taiwan has not been very much part of the social media, and the special relationship or the quiet relationship India has with Taiwan is also not very much as a talking point in social media. Although I would say that in the print media and on television, certainly Taiwanese relations and the complications, the possibilities, and the need for cooperation have been discussed by various specialists, and that itself has been a change that has been seen only in the last 2 or 3 years. So India certainly has made a lot of progress in its own sort of in the absence of a Taiwan Relations Act, but relations with Taiwan have improved in width and depth. That said, Nancy Pelosi's visit is something that I would be surprised if there are any official statements negating that visit. We have to see, against the advisability of such a visit from Delhi. That would probably not at all happen, and there would be no advantage in doing that. Silence might be an option, or a reasonably softly worded statement about advising caution and good sense and patience on all sides, etc. So we'll see what happens. I'm not too sure, but in the public discourse, I think something more could be said, voicing concern for the situation as well as support for Taipei. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Srikande, for your response. My next question is for Ms. Haider. Chinese strategic community often talks about a multi-front crisis. They say a war in the Taiwan Strait will detonate at least 3 battlefields. One, a Sino-Japanese one in the East China Sea. Second, a Sino-Indian one in the southwest. And third, the South China Sea issue. What are your views on this? We often hear about India's two-front challenge, but much less about China's multi-front challenge. Do you think there should be more discussion on this issue in India context?
Antara, you're absolutely right. And as I said earlier, I do think there should be discussions. I do want to also clarify that I'm not saying India must take a stand when it comes to a possible Chinese invasion in Taiwan. I'm merely making the case that I don't think the government will make a stand, simply because I'm just looking at or analyzing how the government has reacted so far. After all, in any such scenario, and you're talking about the Chinese strategic community discussing a three-front situation, we are discussing a live situation at the line of actual control. Since April 2020, when Chinese PLA soldiers first transgressed India's line of actual control, they have occupied places along the line of control, or at least in disputed territory. But we have not seen a vocal reaction from the government on this issue. We have not even seen a really proper briefing on the issue, apart from hearing from Prime Minister Modi himself, who said in June 2020 that nobody is inside Indian territory and no one came inside Indian territory. Since then, we have not had any updates on what exactly is going on over there. I think the last statement was perhaps made by the CDS. Unfortunately, he passed away in that crash, but General Rawat had said that wherever Chinese soldiers are is their territory. If that is going to be the Indian reaction to a Chinese aggression at the line of actual control, it remains to me very, very unlikely that there is going to be a stronger reaction to something that happens on another front in Taiwan. So I'm just being a realist over here. If you wanted to go further and look at the three scenarios that we could possibly see, one, that India does nothing at all. And as I said, given that when Russia invaded Ukraine, which is a separate territory from Russia, the government has not criticized Russia in any way, has not signed on to even one resolution at the United Nations, at the IAEA, at the Human Rights Council, where they actually say that, where they criticize Russia's actions. All they've said is they'd like a ceasefire and they'd like, talks to resume. The second scenario, so the first scenario is really not speak at all publicly, which is, according to, I think even this panel, seems quite likely. The second would be to step up aggression at the LAC if there was some kind of an aggression on Taiwan, which would give us, which would be a sort of two-pronged thing, because it would help India maybe take advantage of Chinese being deterred or diverted to another front at that time. The second would be perhaps for India to help Taiwan, or certainly to make that criticism of any aggression on Taiwan much more vocal by stepping up at the LAC. Again, this does not seem extremely likely scenario at present. We haven't seen any kind of a statement from India when it comes to Taiwan. And remember, right now we're looking at a possible scenario when Nancy Pelosi goes to Taiwan. In October last year, we saw a scenario where I think there were 149 flights that China sent in over the ADIZ. And we didn't see any kind of a response at that time either. And the third possibility was for India to join some kind of a naval military alliance. Again, this does sound very far-fetched. India is not part of any military alliance. Even when it comes to the Quad, India is in fact quite cautious about how much militarization the Quad will see. And now we see even from the US and other Quad partners, they all talk about this being a non-military grouping of countries. So none of these actually seems likely as a scenario today. But I do think, as I said earlier, Azra, that these discussions must be held. The worst possible thing, particularly when you're dealing with countries like China, is a sense of ambiguity about what one's response may or may not be. If you leave things blurry, if you leave things in a sense, you don't draw your red lines, it becomes extremely difficult to draw them out later. And a word just over here of how the United States has even treated this entire Pelosi visit. The fact that they have built in this ambiguity that Nancy Pelosi may go to Taiwan or she may not. Obviously, they can't put it in the official announcement simply because Taiwan is not a country like the other countries in Asia she's visiting. But the fact that they've left the ambiguity till the last minute unnecessarily draws out a situation of tension. And as we know, the more tension there is, the more chance there is of a mission when everybody is primed for something to happen. The fact that the President of the United States says that he doesn't think it would be a very constructive idea for Ms. Pelosi to go, again, it draws ambiguity into this. China, on the other hand, is not putting any ambiguity by it. They're saying very clearly, we don't believe that the US House Speaker would travel to Taiwan if she didn't have some kind of tacit backing from the US government, and they would see it as a sort of aggression. But what I'm saying is it is necessary for all of us to understand that these ambiguities don't help the situation. You have to be very clear about where you stand on things, because the other part of this ambiguity is building a scenario inside India where people think the government is taking a very tough stand, if you like, on an issue where actually they're not taking a stand at all.
Thanks, Suhasini, for your response. My next question is for Professor Rajagopalan. Sir, as the Pelosi episode intensifies, I can see discussion in Chinese media on how India is going to react, how what India's strategy is to leverage such a situation in its favor. So my question to you, sir, is: do you think India has a strategy in this regard? I also see some Chinese analysts arguing that given the strength gap between China and India, India's reaction would not be very different from that in the Russia-Ukraine crisis. That is, it will not completely align itself with the US or the Western stance. Do you see truth in such assertions, or do you think it is just wishful thinking?
Yeah, I obviously it's very difficult to see what India's reaction would be, and given India's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, one is not very hopeful. But the other side of this equation is that that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would have far more direct consequences, and so I think India has got into this habit of of trying to keep its head down on any issue that happens, and therefore hoping that issue would go away. And we have seen in the case of Ukraine, that doesn't go away. And then I think initial estimates or initial Indian official assessments that there will be no invasion of Ukraine prove to be wrong, and I suspect that there might be some sort of similar outcome in Taiwan also. And the problem is that I don't think that there is sufficient thought about what to do in case the expected outcome doesn't happen, in case the unexpected happens, that is in case of an actual Chinese invasion of Taiwan. So overall the consequences would be so disastrous for India. I think India really should not keep quiet, but that is something that obviously requires something for the government to do. At the public level, I think obviously there is some beginnings of a debate about what might be the consequences, and that is good. But I don't think that really feeds into what the government is doing. We don't really have to. Obviously, we don't have a direct option in terms of intervening or providing direct military support or anything of that kind to Taiwan. But there are other ways that we can complicate China's calculation. So Suhasini mentioned about putting pressure on the Ladakh sector. But I am a bit skeptical that India would have that sort of India would sort of do that. Once again, India is, as she also mentioned, India has not even protested sufficiently to the LAC incursion of India. It hasn't even sort of fully acknowledged the fact that we've lost territory along the LAC. And so it is a bit difficult to imagine that they would go to the extent of taking advantage of something that happens in Taiwan to reclaim some territory or put pressure on China in the Ladakh and the Tibet sector. But India can do other things. For example, jointly under the Quad, India can make statements about Taiwan or about the need for stability across the Taiwan Straits or peace across the Taiwan Straits. India can also do other things. It's in the BRICS and SCO for God knows what reason, but nevertheless, since we are there, we can make sure that Russia and China together does not pass resolutions and things of that kind that justifies any potential future actions of that kind. I mean, at the very least, we should not be party to something of that kind. So, so I think there are things that, short of taking active action, there are any number of ways in which India can signal that it will not be that it will not look kindly upon a sort of an invasion of Taiwan. There are other things that, again, the US, ultimately a lot of it will also depend on the United States. So if the United States at some point says that an invasion of Taiwan would lead to a fundamental change in how the US views Taiwan and China relations, I mean, for example, if it decides to recognize Taiwan as an independent state, I think that would dramatically change the circumstances for India. But I don't think that's on the offing right away, but I'm saying that those are things that India could discuss with its partners. Yes, Quad has, unfortunately, after an initial focus on security immediately after the 2020 LAC incursion, India has again seems to have pushed for desecuritization of the Quad, which is actually a problem for India because the other three members are anyway security partners, that they don't really have to have the Quad in order to bolster their security partnership. It is India that needs the Quad to bolster the security partnership. So it is India that's setting the pace, and unfortunately, the pace and the direction of that is towards desecuritizing the Quad rather than further securitizing it. And so that's a bit of an unfortunate development, but nevertheless, the Quad and other trilaterals that India is involved with do provide those options of of both discussing with its partners, but also of signaling to China about how India would at Taiwan if any kind of potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan. I don't know whether India will actually do that, but nevertheless, I think those are the kind of options that India should explore.
Thank you, Professor. Dr. Sana Hashmi, my question to you is about Taiwan's new southbound policy. I read that China is very, very skeptical of the policy on ground that it will institutionalize India-Taiwan economic ties, reduce Taiwan's dependency on the mainland. So tell us more about the politics of Taiwan's new southbound policy. How does India fit into it, and how cooperation has proceeded so far under this framework? And also, what do you think, what else can be done under this framework between India and Taiwan?
Before I talk about the new southbound policy, I also want to add something to India's response. If we are talking about India's response in the near future, for example, in the coming month or even in a year, I feel that India's response is going to be the same and the usual statement that it comes out in when there is a conflict, that there needs to be peace and stability in the region and both sides need to sit together and resolve the issue. But with respect to Taiwan, even if India adheres to one China policy, India has never mentioned Taiwan while mentioning one China policy. Of course, we don't really have to read too much between the lines, but of course, I feel that this is also one of the most important points that we really need to keep in mind when we talk about one China policy. But I think we're having discussion about India's response if there is any Taiwan contingency. But I think what we should look at is how to prevent this crisis, because it's, of course, not in anyone's interest. It's not an issue that is not going to impact India. I think first we really need to be sure about it. We have to realize that it is going to impact it. Taiwan under China's control is not at all in India's interest. And I feel India also has to take, if not a stand, it has to start taking steps to assure that India plays a role in preventing this crisis. And I think this could happen at two levels. First is it could happen at regional or mini-lateral level. First, of course, Quad, Professor Rajesh already talked about Quad, and I feel that Quad is a very important platform in that context. But as we have seen that all the other three countries they have talked about Taiwan at the bilateral, at the multilateral level, but it's primarily because of India's hesitance that we haven't really seen that Taiwan has come up in the Quad statement. So I feel that India has to really lose hesitation somewhere. And Quad is one platform. I think this is one of the safest. And what India has to do is to just say that we want peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. This is the minimum I think India could do when it comes to the cross-strait relations. And I feel there is a Taiwan-led mini-lateral called Global Cooperation Training Framework. So that has US and Japan and even now Australia at the representative level. They're participating at the representative level, but India has never participated in that. Now these three countries are members, but if India also lose this hesitation and at least at the representative level could participate in that, I feel that it could really help all the countries. And they really don't talk about security issues. They talk about non-traditional security threats. So I think it also benefits India, but India has been hesitant there as well. But I believe there are also few things that could be done at the bilateral level. And I feel that Taiwan also needs to do a lot of things. Taiwan also has to do a lot of lobbying, like how it does with other countries. We have seen it with the US, and now we are seeing it with a lot of Central European countries. And why not with India? So I think Taiwan also gives it very easily. There is a misaligned approach, I feel. While India wants to have more and more cooperation in the economic field, Taiwan wants something political, perhaps political statement that should come out of India. So I feel that their priorities are they're not on the same page right now. But I believe that what the two countries could do is to, and in fact, this has been Taiwan's official policy with respect to India, that India should maintain parallel ties with Taiwan and China. And the focus should not be on security or political or defense issues, but the emphasis should be on more increasing the avenues for cooperation in the areas that do not really harm both India as well as Taiwan's respective relations with China. And I believe that it's important because once cooperation is improved in non-political areas, especially economic, science and technology, and even education and cultural aspects, the stakes will be higher in the relationship. So I think this is what both India and Taiwan should aim for. And while China is going to remain a decisive factor in India-Taiwan relation, it's also important to make distinction about Taiwan's role in the wider Indo-Pacific region now. And I feel that India, at least at some level, it needs to start getting over this ad hocism that it practices with Taiwan. And now with respect to the New Southbound policy, and I think it's a very important policy. Taiwan is trying to reach out to India, especially through the New Southbound policy and the new foreign policy framework to engage countries that were not traditionally on Taiwan's strategic radar. So the policy is relatively new, and the focus is on areas such as commercial, people-to-people relations, resource sharing, etc. And within the framework of the policy, I feel that nothing substantial has happened yet, and also because it's just a 6-year-old policy. But as I said, that it's relatively newer policy, and it will take some time for us to see the results with the new Southbound policy. But what is also a problem here is that India does not acknowledge the new Southbound policy, and India does not officially include Taiwan as a part of the Act East policy. So I feel, and also from China's side, I haven't really seen any reaction from the Chinese side, because NSP is also one of the least controversial policies when it comes to foreign policy framework of Taiwan. So I feel that we haven't really seen much reaction from China, and there's a lot of potential for both Taiwan and India to cooperate within the framework of new Southbound policy.
Thank you, Dr. Hashmi, for your response. Let me move on to Admiral Srikhande with my next question. So there are reports in the Chinese media about the possibility of India selling supersonic missiles, particularly BrahMos, to Taiwan. It is being argued that after Philippines and the other Southeast Asian countries, Taiwan might be the next destination for BrahMos missiles. What is your view on this issue? Should or shouldn't India explore such options, and what can be the ramification of such a policy?
I think it is understandable why Chinese media, brings out these things. I don't think, at least I have not seen anything in the media about such a potential sale of the BrahMos to Taiwan. That would be something that can happen much later. But I agree with what Sana was saying. There are lots of actually doable, doable areas for cooperation with Taiwan, which we should think about, which we need to talk about more openly. So the BrahMos missile, I think we still need to make have a few more other partners in ASEAN and elsewhere with whom we have a better framework of relationships where that is possible, rather than with Taiwan, where it is currently not possible, no matter what sort of Beijing might say to provoke some reactions or something. That aside, let's look at the whole issue from sort of Taipei's point of view, from the Taiwanese government's point of view. If they really thought that there was such a risk imposed upon Taiwan with the U.S. House Speaker's visit, they might have themselves suggested that look, it's not a great idea for a war to start over this visit, where we will pay the main price. And so will the world, as in terms of consequences. So it's possible. That's why the visit might take place, and it's possible that internally Taiwan may have made some assessments, which we can only guess about this. But as Professor Rajgopalan was also saying, I mean, a cross-strait invasion is not something that China can do on the fly. Taiwan has made some preparations, although I think they are in many ways going past some of the stipulations that they had created for themselves in terms of their acquisition and force planning issues, or what I think they call the overall defense concept, which was about 2 years old. They are making departures from that and actually creating, or at least thinking of reconfiguring some aspects of sea mines, etc., which they did not concentrate upon sufficiently to make the sort of cost of such an invasion much more severe on Beijing. And I think Beijing understands that. In weeks to come, I think Taiwan might take greater steps to bolstering its own defenses and creating a situation where its own security can be assured by actions that Taiwan takes. And some of the other steps, I think, yes, we also ought to take to build up this relationship. It's a good opportunity because there will be, things that will happen. The friction between Beijing and India over issues with Taiwan are not going to end with Miss Nancy Pelosi's visit finishing and she going back. These are just waypoints of irritants or things that India has stayed silent about, or Beijing has created a shindy about. So those things are going to continue, and therefore there has to be a long-term thinking on India's, statements about Taiwan. I mean, so I agree with the fellow panelists that we need to think of the future also, and how to be more robust about it.
Right. Thank you, Admiral Shrikande. Professor Rajagopalan, do you also have similar views on the BrahMos issues? Do you think it is currently not in the, nobody in India is actually planning on this line?
Yeah, Admiral Shrikande would probably know much more about the BrahMos than I do, but I haven't heard anything. I mean, I've about say the BrahMos to Taiwan, and I'm a little bit skeptical. We are India is very coy when it comes to even political relationships, any kind of political relationship with Taiwan. So the idea that, as Sana was telling us earlier, as the idea that we would sell military equipment seems to me, at least given the current circumstances, highly unlikely. But even if we do not, there are ways of cooperating even without providing something as high profile as a BrahMos system, because that would be fairly high profile. I would obviously love it if India would get over its hesitancy and provide those kinds of systems. But even in its absence, we can do other things. For example, we have a fairly robust um, satellite surveillance systems. And our Earth observation satellites are pretty good. We can provide intelligence to Taiwan, even though I'm sure they're getting a lot of that from the United States and probably. And no, there is sufficient. They are not lacking for that, I'm sure. But nevertheless, there is no harm in India doing those kinds of things. And obviously, we have a lot to learn about China. And my sense of Indian intelligence capabilities vis-a-vis China is that it is rather poor. So Taiwan obviously is much better. So there are areas where we can cooperate, things that we can exchange without necessarily it being on the front pages. And so we have for decades had those kinds of subterranean relationships, for example, with the Straits. And similarly, we could do that with Taiwan. I mean, there are a lot can be done. I mean, the problem is that the hesitancy at the political level that I think is a bit of an issue. So I think short of that, outside of that, I think if we can resolve that, I think we should really get moving, if not on the BrahMos, on other forms of cooperation.
Thank you, Professor, for that clarification. Now let's move on to yet another important topic, that is Indian media space. Taiwan and how China has been influencing Indian media on Taiwan issue. Suhasini, my question to you is that last year there has been news about how Chinese embassy in India has issued advisory to Indian media community against providing platform to Taiwan or Taiwanese political figures. Do you face such situation on and off? What has been your experience regarding this, and how do you think Indian media should handle issues like this?
And certainly, it's quite public knowledge that the Chinese embassy in Delhi and the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs is extremely sharp when it comes to any kind of coverage of Taiwan, particularly Taiwan politics and the nomenclature used for Taiwanese officials. I think it is for media organizations to follow the diplomatic norms that they are comfortable with. In this case, with what the Indian government's position is and what India's traditional position has been, which is that India does not recognize Taiwan. However, the Taiwanese Economic and Cultural Cooperation Center is based in Delhi. India has a similar outpost in Taipei as well. And certainly their activities are public knowledge. This is not something that is done surreptitiously. So I think that it is for governments to try and push, and particularly on disputes, give their point of view. We see it a lot of times, perhaps in the India-Pakistan equation as well. But I think eventually media houses have to work according to their precepts and according to how they see the diplomatic situation, and so we haven't actually had to change our position in any way. And I think China's reaction or China's objections are fairly well known. Despite that, there is as I said, a TECC that exists in Delhi, and the one that does organize events, speaks to journalists, discusses economic cooperation between Delhi and Taipei, and so forth.
Thank you, Suhasini. My question for Sana is regarding India-Taiwan economic ties. You have written in your latest paper about the centrality of economic cooperation in India-Taiwan ties, particularly cooperation in the field of high technology, manufacture of chips for electronic products and communication equipment, and so on and so forth. But I see China is very concerned about such cooperation between India and Taiwan. There are also discussions in China's in various public forums in China about about punitive measures against Taiwan, so as to dissuade it to enter into such collaboration, particularly with India. So under such situation, how and to what extent do you think India and Taiwan can explore cooperation in the high technology space?
Yeah, but also on the media question, I would also like to state that how India's position is changing. For example, when Air India changed the name on its website, India actually, even Minister of External Affairs defended that decision. But in 2020 and 2021, we saw how the spokesperson said that our media is independent and they would do what they want to do. So I think there's a change in their position as well, and there's definitely if they're not government news agency. So I think it's fine whatever they want to use with Taiwan. But also on economic relation, it's very much under the mandate of TECC and ITA. Economic is very much there in the name of TECC. So it comes under the mandate of the representative offices, both Taiwan and India. But also in 2012, in fact, Ambassador Bambavle, when he was the Joint Secretary of the East Asian Division, and when India was very keen on initiating the FTA with Taiwan, and they also commissioned a feasibility study, and to the media, they actually responded that if China could benefit from Taiwan, then why not us? So that's also something that we also have to look at, and especially with the semiconductor, there's a lot of interest from India's side. Recently, we saw how Prime Minister Modi met the chairman of Foxconn, and there is DB between Foxconn and Vedanta. But what India is really trying to quote is TSMC, and TSMC's hands are full right now. They are not really looking at India, and there's a lot of difference between what the government wants and what the private sector wants. So I think there's a lot of interest in India with respect to TSMC specifically, which a lot of media houses, they don't really report on, and they always talk about Foxconn. So, but it's not coming anytime soon. But India is really, and especially if you look at the efforts of ITA here, they keep having conferences, they keep having forums. And a few years before, CII, FICCI, they didn't really do a lot of work with Taiwan, but now their quota of events have also increased. Recently, we saw one event. There are a lot of MOUs that are being signed, and even today, we are seeing that a lot of MOUs are being signed between ITA and TECC. So, especially in the field of economics, it's very much under the mandate of their offices. And even if China says something that actually shows that that's very hypocritical of China. There's a lot of investment, Taiwanese investment, even today, even when they're trying to pull out of China, there's a lot of Taiwanese investment in China. So then if I would reiterate what Ambassador Bambavle said, if they could benefit, India could definitely benefit from Taiwanese investment.
Thank you, Dr. Hashmi, for your response. I would now request all the panelists to make their concluding remarks. We can start with Admiral Shrikande.
I mean, I would only like to sort of reiterate, some of the things that we need to ramp up our relationship with Taiwan. There are limitations to what we can do, and there are zones of discomfort within the government, as indeed there are zones of discomfort in the Taiwan relationship between every government that has interaction with Taiwan. So and Beijing doesn't help in any way to reduce that level of discomfort, as Ms. Haider was saying. They object to almost everything anybody says about Taiwan, and we should expect that to continue. But within all that, we have to create the sea room in which Taiwan India relationships improve, to not only because that relationship bilaterally is important, but because on the world diplomatic stage, it could come in handy subsequently. China's pressure on Taiwan, China's pressure and consequences because of the COVID, because of Galwan, because of what's happening along the LAC, Panchen Lama, Dalai Lama, they are losing a lot of diplomatic capital around the world, and we should probably do our part to help them lose a little more of it.
Thank you, Admiral. Suhasini, you can go next.
Sure. I really do think that, as I said earlier, that a lack of this ambiguity is necessary, that the government must be much clearer when it comes to its foreign policy on a region. We've seen a certain ambiguity. After all, India is part of the Quad, and there's a lot of below the radar talk about this being a strategic partnership. At the same time, India is a part of the SCO, which also conducts joint, sort of military or quasi-military exercises, also has strategic parts to it. It is part of the BRICS, which is an economic arrangement with China. It is also part of now the IPEF with the United States. So there's a constant balancing that India needs to do. But there's also the areas of gray are becoming more and more wide. The second place where I think we have to start, have a little more clarity is actually India's relationship with China. The fact is that for the last 2 years, there have been no meetings, perhaps at the prime ministerial level, although before April 2020, Prime Minister Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping met 18 times. 2 of those 18 times were at one-on-one retreat summits that they held. And yet we have no clarity of just where those conversations went. And the third part is India's own relationship with Taiwan. As all our panelists have pointed out, there is a need for a more clear engagement on areas that are beneficial to India. So if semiconductors is an area of benefit to India, then the government must try and explore its options when it comes to Taiwan, one of the big producers. But it also has to be clear about what its red lines are. If, for example, the government is unable to even support Taiwan's observership position at the World Health Assembly, something it did hold for several years in the last decade, then how far can it actually go with some of the other more allied, perhaps, to the Taipei governments, the businesses that are more allied to them. So I think that all 3 of these areas are places where there must be much greater clarity. Above all, there must be much more engagement with what is happening in the Taiwan Straits and what could be the possible ramifications for India if that kind of conflict would get out of hand.
Thank you, Suhasini. Professor Rajagopalan, your comments, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me also. I agree with what the other panelists have said, what Suhasini and Hasana and Administrator have said. The key thing I think that we are not recognizing, and I think there should be greater recognition of, is the dramatic consequences of what an invasion would mean. I think this goes beyond, at this stage, economic aspects are important. I don't disagree with that. We definitely need to explore, economic relations, especially considering the level of economic ties that China and Taiwan have. We don't need to be more loyal than Beijing on those kinds of issues. But nevertheless, the most serious issue that we face is a potential invasion and the consequence of that invasion, irrespective of how that invasion goes. I mean, whether that invasion succeeds or fails, the consequences will be quite disastrous for the region, because disastrous for India. So I think that part of it, I think Sana or somebody mentioned this earlier, that what is most consequential is not is to sort of, what's most important is to sort of head that off and sort of try to deter that or try to prevent that from happening at all. And I think that is what is critical, I think. And what Suhasini said also, would having get a clarity, being upfront about the consequences would actually help in preventing, or at least hopefully changing China's calculus. So I think that is something that we need to, I think at the official level, that the government has to sort of recognize that this is not, Ukraine is bad enough, but if there is something happens in Taiwan, we are looking at a completely uncharted waters after that. I mean, I think it's going to be an enormously difficult situation after that, and I think India should do what it can in order to prevent that outcome from happening. And then by that outcome, I mean the invasion itself, irrespective of the consequences of that invasion. So clarity there would be definitely be hopefully helpful in affecting China's capitalism. Let me stop.
Thank you, Professor. Dr. Hashmi, your remarks.
Thank you, Antara, and I really enjoyed the discussion. So I'll end with from where we started, Pelosi's visit and the implications. So I believe that why we are seeing this reaction from China is because Taiwan's international space is increasing. And if we go back to 2016 when Saigon came to power and when DPP refused to accept 1992 consensus, China has been trying to shrink Taiwan's international space. And now a lot of countries are speaking for Taiwan and are talking about Taiwan. So I believe this is something that China doesn't want. And if we really want to think about India and India's interest in the Indo-Pacific region, I believe it's very important for us to discuss within the think tank circle, and we people from the strategic community, we really need to keep discussing Taiwan and the implication of any eventuality in the cross strait. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hashmi. Thank you, everyone. With that, we have come to the very end of our session. This has been a great discussion, truly engaging and enriching. Thank you very much to all our panelists for participating in today's discussion and providing us with such interesting perspectives on the Taiwan issue. I personally learned so much, and there is so much more to reflect on as we end this session today. Hope to be back with yet another interesting panel on equally important issue. Till then, take care and bye-bye.